The nights in the old American village always carried a hush that spoke louder than words. When the sun dipped behind the rolling hills and the lanterns along the dirt road flickered to life, the world seemed both wide and close at the same time. Folks lived by simple rules here: hard work in the daylight, quiet prayers at night, and a trust that their neighbors would do the same. The clap of horses' hooves, the smell of wood smoke, the sound of a fiddle carried through the evening air. These were the things that made life steady, even in times when nothing else was certain. But this night was different, because a stranger had ridden into town, and his presence stirred whispers that traveled quicker than the autumn wind. He was a tall cowboy, broad-shouldered and built from years of labor under the western sun. Dust clung to his boots and his hat shadowed eyes that seemed to hold both fire and sorrow. He spoke little at first, but his silence spoke volumes. Men on the porch of the saloon watched him closely, and women behind lace curtains peered with guarded curiosity. A man like him did not ride into a quiet place without reason. His horse, a dark and restless beast, pawed the ground as if it too carried secrets no one dared to voice. Folks wondered if he was running from something, or riding toward it. In the center of the village, the widow's house stood a little apart from the rest, its porch light often burning later than any other. She lived alone now, her days spent tending chickens, mending clothes, and keeping herself busy in ways that numbed the ache of loss. She was young enough for her grief to still weigh heavy, yet strong enough to carry it without complaint. People respected her, though pity often lingered in their looks. It was not scandal they whispered about, but loneliness, and loneliness had a way of echoing through thin walls on cold nights. She had never expected him to knock on her door. The hour was late, and the village had already gone quiet when the sound came, sharp and steady against the wood. She paused, candlelight flickering across her face, her hands trembling just slightly as she opened the door. There he stood, the cowboy with eyes dark as the night sky, hat in hand, his voice low as he asked if she might spare him shelter. The wind tugged at his coat and she could see the fatigue in the slump of his shoulders. He did not beg, but something in his tone carried weight, something that told her he had not asked for help in many years. Her first thought was to refuse. It was not proper for a woman alone to welcome a stranger under her roof. Yet there was a pull in his presence, an honesty she could not deny. Against her own caution, she stepped back, opening the door just enough for him to enter. The smell of pine and leather filled her home as he crossed the threshold. She placed another log on the fire, the crackle of flames filling the silence between them. They spoke little at first. He sat near the hearth, warming hands that bore scars of work and struggle. She poured him a cup of coffee and he nodded his thanks without lifting his eyes. He seemed a man weighed down by burdens unspoken, and she, though curious, did not press. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, a reminder of how easily the world could feel unsteady. Inside, however, the stillness between them was sharp, almost fragile. It was when she brought out an extra quilt that their eyes finally met. Her voice was soft, almost uncertain when she admitted, "I've never shared a bed." The words slipped from her lips like a confession, heavy with innocence and honesty. Her cheeks flushed the moment they left her mouth, and she quickly lowered her gaze, embarrassed at how it must have sounded. The cowboy's lips curved into the faintest smile, not mocking but gentle, as if he understood the weight behind her words. He leaned slightly forward, his voice steady yet kind as he answered, "Then tonight you'll share my heart." His tone was not bold, not meant to scare, but to offer comfort where fear lingered. It was the kind of reply that carried warmth on a night when the cold pressed hard against the windows. She did not know what to say. The firelight danced across his face, revealing lines carved by the sun and by pain. He was not a man of flattery, that much was clear. His words felt true, almost dangerous in their simplicity. Her heart pounded in her chest, torn between the urge to retreat and the urge to trust. The hours stretched slowly. The village outside slept in peace, unaware of the tension building in the small room where two lives had unexpectedly crossed. She busied herself with small tasks, straightening the table, folding fabric, refilling the kettle. Yet she could not shake the sound of his voice, nor could she forget the way his gaze lingered on her, not with hunger, but with something steadier, something she had not known in a long while. When he finally spoke again, it was to tell her of the road, not of every detail, but of the dust and the miles, the kind of loneliness only a saddle can bring. She listened quietly, drawn not only to his words but to the spaces between them. He had lost things too, of that she was sure. Perhaps not the same as her own losses, but enough to carve him into the man who now sat before her. As the fire burned low, her candle flickering toward its end, The air seemed charged with something unspoken. She stood by the window, staring out at the moonlit fields, wondering if she had been a fool to open her door. He watched her from his chair, silent, patient, as if waiting for her to decide what kind of night this would be. The quilt lay folded in her hands, heavy with both comfort and decision. She turned toward him, her breath catching in her chest, torn between the rules of her world and the pull of something stronger. His smile had faded now, replaced with a look that was steady and unreadable, a look that seemed to ask a question she was not yet ready to answer. And in that moment, with the wind pressing harder against the shutters and the last glow of firelight casting shadows along the walls, the night held its breath. Neither of them moved, neither of them spoke. What happened next would change everything, but for now the world stood still, waiting. The silence between them that night seemed louder than any words. She held the quilt in her hands, the fabric trembling just enough to give away the storm inside her. He didn't move, didn't push, only watched her with a patience that unnerved her more than impatience ever could. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters again, and the sound of the old house creaking under the cold filled the space between their breaths. For a moment she thought of sending him back into the night, of closing the door and sealing herself away as she had done so many times before. But she knew the memory of his words, soft, unhurried, steady, would haunt her even if she turned him away. She finally placed the quilt across the chair nearest the hearth. Her hands brushed against his as she set it down, and though the touch lasted only a second, it carried more weight than she wanted to admit. His skin was rough, calloused by years of work, yet warm in a way that reminded her of something she had forgotten. She pulled her hand back quickly, clearing her throat and murmuring something about the hour. He nodded, lowering his gaze, as if to let her know he would take no more than she was ready to give. She moved into the small room she kept for herself, the walls lined with shelves of jars, and the bed tucked neatly in the corner. She left the door slightly ajar, unable to bring herself to close it entirely. From where she lay, she could see the faint glow of the fire still flickering in the main room. She could hear him shifting once, maybe twice, before all went quiet. Her heart pounded long after her eyes closed, and though exhaustion pulled at her, sleep did not come easy. The next morning, she found him already awake. He was out by the fence, his coat pulled tight, repairing a board that had been loose for weeks. She stood at the doorway, startled by the sight. He hadn't asked. He simply took it upon himself as if he belonged. When he noticed her watching, he tipped his hat with the smallest of smiles before returning to the task. She felt a stir of something she hadn't felt in a long time, both unease and gratitude, an odd mix that made her unsure of herself. Over breakfast, their words came easier. She asked where he was headed, and though he gave no clear answer, the way he looked down into his cup made her believe his journey had more to do with what he was running from than what he was riding toward. He asked about her hens, her garden, small things, as if he were testing the edges of her life. And though she told herself she owed him nothing, she found herself sharing pieces of her story too. Not all of it, but enough to reveal the outline of who she was. A woman who had known loss, who had built her days around work so she would not drown in the quiet. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm she hadn't expected. He fixed what needed fixing, chopped wood without being asked, and carried water when the pails felt too heavy for her. He never demanded, never took more than was offered, yet his presence filled the air. The villagers noticed, of course. They always did. Whispers trailed behind her when she went into town, whispers about the cowboy who had taken up at her place. Some said he was dangerous, others that he carried sorrow on his back like a saddlebag. No one knew his name, or if they did, no one spoke it. He was simply the stranger, the drifter, the man who had come uninvited but stayed as if fate had led him to her door. At night, the unease returned. She told herself it was foolish, that she should have sent him on his way, yet something in her refused to let go of his company. The sound of his boots across the porch, the scrape of his chair by the fire, even the quiet way he spoke her name. All these things unsettled her in ways she could not explain. And still, when she lay in her bed, she thought of his words on that first night. She had never shared a bed, not with anyone since she had lost her husband, and certainly never with a stranger. Yet here was a man whose presence in her house stirred something she thought had long ago died. It wasn't just about comfort. It was about trust, about the thin line between fear and hope. She wondered if he felt the same storm inside, or if to him, she was simply a roof and a warm fire on a cold road. One evening, as the last light faded over the hills, she found him sitting on the porch, sharpening a knife with slow, steady strokes. The sound of the steel against stone carried through the still air. She joined him, standing quietly beside the railing, the cool wind brushing her hair. For a while they didn't speak, and then he said something that caught her off guard. "I've spent years chasing something I can't name," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the fading horizon. "Every mile I ride, I think I'll find it at the next bend, but when I get there, it's gone. Sometimes I wonder if I'm meant to find it at all." She didn't answer at first. His words pressed heavy on her chest, for she too had been chasing something, not across miles of road, but inside herself, in the long, quiet nights when she tried to remember what it meant to feel alive. At last she said softly, "Maybe it's not out there. Maybe it's here, in the stillness we keep running from." He looked at her then, really looked, as if her words had cut deeper than she realized. The knife stilled in his hand, and for a moment the weight of the evening seemed to hang between them, fragile and unspoken. The mystery of him grew with each passing day. She knew enough to see he carried a past filled with hardship, but not enough to understand what had driven him to her door. Sometimes she thought she saw pain in his eyes, a shadow that flickered like the firelight, but before she could name it, it was gone. He guarded his secrets well, but not so tightly that she couldn't feel them pressing against the edges of their silence. Suspense seemed to weave itself into the fabric of her life now. Every time he rose before dawn, every time he lingered on the porch staring into the distance, she wondered if he was preparing to leave. And every time he returned to sit by the fire at night, she wondered if he had already decided to stay. Her heart leaned one way, her reason the other, and she found herself caught in the pull of both. The villagers began to question her more openly. A woman at the market asked if she wasn't afraid, letting a stranger under her roof. Another warned her in hushed tones that men who drifted often carried trouble close behind. Their words gnawed at her, planting seeds of doubt, but when she returned home and found him repairing the barn door or feeding the chickens as if it were his own land, those doubts blurred into confusion. Still, she couldn't escape the feeling that something waited just beyond the horizon. His past, her fear, the fragile trust forming between them. It was all leading somewhere, though neither of them spoke it aloud. Some nights, she thought she heard him stir awake by the dying fire, as if haunted by dreams too heavy to carry. Other nights, she lay awake wondering if she was the dream he feared losing. The days were simple, yet beneath the simplicity ran a current of tension, steady and undeniable, the kind of tension that could break at any moment, changing everything. And though she tried to push it aside, she knew the question lingered in both their hearts. Was he meant to be a passing shadow on her doorstep? Or was this the beginning of something neither of them had dared to imagine? The answer did not come, not yet. The night stretched on, the days rolled forward, and the house held them in its quiet, waiting for what neither of them was ready to say. The wind carried dust down the main road of the village as autumn pressed deeper into the land. The fields were turning brown, the nights colder, and the air sharp enough to make folks hurry home before dark. Yet her house remained a place where the lamp stayed burning longer than most, a quiet glow against the silence of the hills. Inside, the cowboy had settled into a rhythm that was both steady and unsettling. He worked with his hands as though he belonged, repairing fences, tending animals, even building a new trough from spare wood. Yet behind every chore, behind every quiet word, there was a shadow in his eyes that made it clear he carried more than just dust from the road. The widow noticed it most in the evenings. When the fire burned low and the rest of the world seemed to sleep, he would sit in the chair near the hearth with his gaze fixed far away, as though watching something only he could see. Sometimes his hand would twitch near his belt, as though reaching for a gun no one else had drawn. She would watch him from her doorway, torn between curiosity and fear. She wanted to ask, wanted to demand to know what burden he carried, but her tongue stayed still. The fear of the answer was greater than the silence. The villagers, however, had no hesitation in voicing their suspicions. Whispers turned into talk, and talk soon turned into bold words said where she could hear them. Some believed he was running from the law, that somewhere down the trail he had left trouble too heavy to name. Others thought he was a hired gun, a man of violence who had chosen the quiet of their small place to hide from his past. Children were told to stay off the road when he rode into town, and more than one man at the saloon kept his hand close to his holster whenever the cowboy passed through. She tried to defend him in quiet ways, telling a neighbor he was helping with the work, reminding others he had not caused any harm. Yet she too felt the weight of their questions. What if they were right? What if the kindness he showed her was nothing more than a mask? Late at night she lay awake, hearing the creak of the floorboards as he moved through the house, and she wondered if she had made the greatest mistake of her life letting him in. But the truth was not so simple. The cowboy had his own reasons, though he spoke little of them. One night, after too much silence, he let slip a few words that only deepened the mystery. "Some things a man can't outrun," he said softly, staring into the fire. "Doesn't matter how far you ride, they catch up just the same." He did not look at her as he said it, but she felt the words as if they were aimed straight into her heart. For she too knew what it meant to be chased by something unseen, grief that followed her from dawn to dusk, loneliness that clung to her like a shadow. As the days passed, a new tension grew. A rider appeared one afternoon, his horse lathered from the long road. He stopped at the saloon, asked too many questions, and left with eyes sharper than most. Word spread quickly that he was looking for someone, though no one said outright who. When the widow heard of it, she felt a chill run through her bones. That night she found the cowboy sitting on the porch, his hat pulled low. His jaw was set, his silence harder than usual. She asked if he knew the man. He did not answer. But the way his hand tightened around the arm of the chair was answer enough. It was clear now that his past had followed him here. The conflict did not lie only outside the house, but within it too. She found herself caught between fear and trust, torn by feelings she did not know how to name. His presence unsettled her, yet it also gave her a strength she had forgotten she still carried. When he spoke, even in the few words he used, she felt her walls cracking. And when she saw him work quietly through the day, fixing what she could not fix, she wondered if maybe he was meant to be here, no matter what shadows clung to him. The villagers were not so forgiving. At the market, two men cornered her near the stalls. They told her plain that a woman alone had no business sheltering a stranger with no past he could speak of. They warned her that men like him brought trouble wherever they went, and that she would be the one left to pay the price. Their words burned into her ears, but she said nothing, carrying her basket home in silence. Yet as she crossed her porch, she saw him splitting wood, sweat running down his brow, his frame solid against the setting sun, and she felt anger rise. Anger not at him, but at the way the world was quick to condemn without understanding. Still, doubt crept in. She began to notice every small detail she had once overlooked, the way he flinched at sudden noises, the way he never slept too deeply, the way his eyes scanned the horizon as though expecting someone to appear. These things unsettled her, not because they revealed cruelty, but because they revealed a man who was hunted by something larger than himself. And though she wanted to ask, wanted to demand the truth, the words froze in her throat each time. One night, when the fire had burned low and the house was silent, she heard him rise from his chair and step outside. She followed quietly, barefoot across the boards, and watched him from the doorway. He stood in the moonlight, his hand resting on the neck of his horse, his head bowed as though in prayer. The sight of him there, so strong and yet so broken, made her chest ache in a way she did not understand. He whispered something she could not catch, and then looked up at the stars as if waiting for an answer. She slipped back inside before he saw her, her heart pounding with questions. The days stretched longer with unease. The rider who had come asking questions had not returned, but his shadow lingered in the minds of the villagers. Some began to avoid her, no longer willing to stop for conversation, no longer offering a smile when she passed. Her place, once a quiet part of the village, now felt like a line drawn between her and everyone else. And still, the cowboy remained, carrying his silence like a second skin. There were small moments that bound them tighter despite the doubt. The time he chased off a pack of coyotes that had been circling her henhouse, standing tall in the moonlight with his rifle in hand. The morning he mended her old fence gate, carving the wood carefully as if it mattered more than any job he had ever done. The way he spoke her name, soft, careful, almost reverent, when she least expected it. These things pulled her closer, even as fear told her to keep her distance. The conflict inside her grew heavier with each day. She could not deny that she wanted him there, wanted his presence, his strength, even his mystery. Yet the whispers of the village rang loud, and the shadow of the rider who had come searching still hung over them. Her nights grew restless again, her sleep broken by dreams of hoofbeats pounding closer, of doors splintering, of voices shouting in the dark. She would wake with her heart racing, only to hear the steady sound of his boots moving across the porch, as though he too could not rest. And so the days went on, thick with suspense. The widow and the cowboy moved around each other like two souls tied by fate, but afraid to name it. The villagers waited for something to break, some proof of what they believed. The wind carried dust and questions down the road, and the land seemed to hold its breath. Whatever truth the cowboy carried, whatever past had driven him here, it was clear now that it would not stay hidden forever. And when it came, when the rider returned or the shadows of his history finally reached the quiet of her home, everything would change. But for now the fire burned, the night stretched long, and the silence between them held all the weight of an unanswered question. The days grew shorter, and the chill of winter began to settle over the old American village. Smoke rose from chimneys earlier in the evening, and the dirt road through town carried fewer footsteps after dark. Yet at the widow's house, the light from her window still burned late, a faint glow across the quiet fields. Inside, the cowboy's presence had become a rhythm she could not imagine breaking. He chopped wood, hauled water, and carried himself with a quiet strength that made her feel less alone. But the unease in him never faded. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing night. He had stopped riding into town. Instead, he stayed close, moving between the barn, the fields, and the porch, always scanning the horizon as though expecting something to appear. The widow noticed the way his hand brushed near his side whenever a noise startled him, the way his jaw tightened when the wind carried the faintest echo of hoofbeats down the road. He was a man bracing for a storm, and she felt it pressing against her too. The villagers kept their distance now. Whispers turned into avoidance, and where once she might have traded greetings at the market, now she walked the stalls in silence. Women turned their heads, men narrowed their eyes, and children who once played near her fence now hurried past without stopping. The sense of isolation grew heavier each day, and though she tried to ignore it, she could not shake the feeling that her home had become a boundary line between her and the rest of the world. One afternoon, as she carried kindling to the porch, she found the cowboy standing by his horse, tightening the saddle straps. For a moment her heart stopped, certain he was leaving. She dropped the bundle at her feet, her voice catching as she asked, "Are you going?" He looked at her, his eyes dark beneath the brim of his hat, and shook his head slowly. "Not yet," he said. "But it's coming." The words chilled her more than the wind. She wanted to ask what was coming, who he was waiting for, what danger he carried on his back. But she didn't. The fear of the answer was worse than the silence. Instead, she nodded and bent to pick up the kindling, her hands trembling as she stacked it by the door. That night, she lay awake long after the fire had died, listening to the sound of his boots pacing across the porch until dawn. It was 3 nights later when the rider returned. She saw him from the window first, just a shadow on the far end of the road, sitting tall in the saddle. The horse was black, its breath fogging in the cold air, and the man upon it wore his hat low, his coat drawn tight. He didn't ride into the village this time. He stayed on the ridge, watching, waiting. The widow's breath caught as she gripped the curtain in her hands. When she turned to tell the cowboy, she found him already at the door, his rifle leaning against the frame. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. He had known this moment would come. The rider stayed until nightfall, then turned and vanished into the hills, but his presence hung heavy over the house. The widow tried to keep her voice steady as she asked who he was. The cowboy did not answer right away. Instead, he sat at the table, his hands pressed against the wood, his head bowed. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost weary. "A man I thought I'd left behind." He said nothing more. Not that night, not the next day. But the silence told her enough. His past had found him, and it was only a matter of time before it came knocking at her door. The tension between them grew tighter with each passing hour. She wanted to demand the truth, to know what kind of danger was about to fall upon her home. But she also feared that knowing would change everything. Instead, she carried on with her chores, her hands busy even as her mind raced. At night, she listened to the creak of the floorboards as he moved through the house, the steady sound of him standing guard, and she wondered how long their fragile world could hold. One evening, the air was so still it felt as though the land itself was holding its breath. The widow was mending by the fire when the cowboy came in from the porch, his face set with a look she had not seen before. It was not fear, not even anger, but a kind of resolve. He leaned his rifle against the wall, removed his hat, and stood for a long moment without speaking. Finally, he said, "You should know if he comes it won't be words he's after." Her sewing slipped from her lap. She wanted to ask who he was, what history had carved such hardness into the cowboy's voice, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she whispered, "Why here? Why my door?" His eyes softened for a moment, just enough for her to glimpse the man beneath the armor. "Because here," he said quietly, "was the first place in a long time I felt like I might stop running." The confession cut deeper than she expected. She turned her face away, tears stinging her eyes. Not from fear, but from the ache of knowing how much weight he carried. She wanted to reach for him, to offer some comfort, but before she could, the sound of distant hoofbeats broke the stillness of the night. The cowboy was already moving. He snatched his rifle, pulled on his coat, and stepped onto the porch. She followed, her hands gripping the doorway, her breath frozen in her chest. The sound grew louder, closer, until the dark shape of riders emerged at the edge of the fields. Not one this time, 3. Their horses kicked up dirt as they slowed, their figures looming in the faint moonlight. The widow felt her heart slam against her ribs. The cowboy stood tall at the edge of the porch, his shadow stretching across the ground, his rifle steady in his hands. The riders stopped just short of the fence, their leader lifting his head to reveal the same man she had seen before, the one who had watched from the ridge. "Thought you could hide forever?" the man called, his voice carrying across the field. The cowboy didn't answer. The silence was sharper than words, filled with years of unfinished reckonings. The widow clutched the doorframe, fear and questions tangling inside her. Who were these men? What did they want? And why did it feel like the quiet of her home was about to shatter into something she could never mend? The leader leaned forward in his saddle, his voice low but cold. "You know what we came for. Step aside, and no one else has to get hurt." The cowboy's voice finally cut through the night. It was steady, hard, and final. "Not here. Not tonight." The widow's breath caught. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down, the world narrowing to the space between the man on her porch and the riders at the fence. Every sound, the horses' snorts, the creak of leather, the rustle of the wind, seemed sharper, louder. The night was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Inside, the fire burned low, casting long shadows along the walls. Outside, 3 riders sat ready, their eyes fixed on the cowboy who stood alone but unyielding. The widow felt her knees weaken, her mind racing with fear and dread. Whatever past he carried had finally arrived at her doorstep, and she knew that before the night was through, nothing would ever be the same again. The standoff stretched on, time slowing to a crawl, and in that silence, with danger pressing closer than ever, the widow realized she was no longer simply a bystander. Whatever storm was about to break, she was already caught in the heart of it. The night felt frozen, as if the earth itself refused to move while the cowboy faced the 3 riders who had come for him. The widow stood just inside the doorway, her hands gripping the frame so tightly her knuckles ached, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might betray her fear aloud. The air was sharp with tension, and the silence stretched so long that every second seemed like a lifetime. The cowboy's rifle was steady, his voice calm as he said again, "Not here. Not tonight." The men on their horses shifted uneasily, their leader studying him with eyes full of old grudges and unfinished business. Finally, the leader dismounted, the crunch of his boots on the frosted earth breaking the stillness. "You can't keep running," he said, his voice low but cutting. "We both know what's owed." The widow's breath caught, and for the first time the cowboy turned his head just slightly toward her. He didn't speak to her, but the look in his eyes said everything, that whatever storm was about to break, he would not let it touch her if he could help it. The truth unraveled in fragments, not in long speeches, but in the charged words traded between him and the man from the ridge. The cowboy had once ridden with them long ago, when desperation had led him down a road lined with bad choices. He had left, walked away from their kind of life, but men like that didn't forgive so easily. They had been hunting him not only for leaving, but for the debt of loyalty they claimed he still owed. What they wanted wasn't gold or land, it was his return, or his silence forever. The widow listened, her heart tightening with every word. The man she had let into her home was not the lawless drifter the villagers had feared, but neither was he the simple stranger he had seemed. He was a man who had carried mistakes heavy on his back, a man who had tried to start fresh but found the past always faster. And now it stood at her doorstep. The standoff stretched into something unbearable. The riders' hands hovered near their holsters, and the widow thought she could hear the sound of her own pulse louder than the wind. She wanted to cry out, to beg them all to leave, but she knew her voice would do nothing here. This was a reckoning long in the making, one that words could not mend. At last the leader spat into the dirt and gave a thin smile. "You always were stubborn," he said. "Maybe tonight's the night it catches up with you." He swung back onto his horse, the other 2 following suit. They didn't charge, not yet. They lingered at the edge of the fence, their silhouettes etched against the moonlight, promising the fight wasn't over. Then, with the crack of reins, they turned and rode off into the night. the sound of their hooves fading into the hills. The widow collapsed into the doorway, her breath spilling out in relief she hadn't realized she was holding. The cowboy lowered his rifle, his shoulders finally dropping, though his face remained carved from stone. He didn't look triumphant, only tired in a way that seemed to reach down into his very bones. Inside, the fire had nearly died, leaving the room dim and heavy with shadows. She followed him as he set the rifle aside and sat at the table, his hat in his hands. He didn't speak at first, and neither did she. The silence was softer now, though, no longer sharp with danger but heavy with all the things unsaid. Finally, she found her voice. "Will they come back?" she asked, her words trembling more than she wanted them to. "Yes," he said simply, his eyes still fixed on the hat in his hands. "Men like that don't quit easy." Her heart tightened. She thought of the life she had built here, the small routines that had kept her steady, the fragile peace she had fought to protect, and now it had been pulled into a fight that wasn't hers. Yet as she looked at him, she knew she couldn't see him as a stranger anymore. His story was tangled with hers now, whether she wanted it or not. The days that followed were quiet but tense. The villagers whispered more than ever, and some avoided her completely. The widow felt the weight of their judgment, but no longer had the strength to answer it. At night, she lay awake listening for hoofbeats, waiting for the sound of riders returning to finish what they had started. But alongside the fear was something else, a strange sense of courage she hadn't known before. The cowboy's presence, though dangerous, had awakened something in her. She realized she wasn't as fragile as she once believed. One evening, as the sun sank low, she found him in the barn brushing down his horse. His movements were slow, almost deliberate, as though he were preparing for something. She stood at the doorway for a long time before speaking. "You don't have to face this alone," she said softly. He stopped, his hand resting on the horse's mane, and for the first time since that night, he looked at her fully. His eyes softened in a way that broke through all the walls he had built. "You've already done more than I ever deserved," he said. "Letting me stay, giving me a chance to breathe again. But this is mine to carry." Tears pricked her eyes, but she held them back. "You're not the only one with a past," she whispered. "We all carry things. Maybe the only way to bear it is not to carry it alone." The words seemed to cut deeper than any blade. For a long time he said nothing. Then finally he reached out and placed his hand gently over hers. It was the first time he had touched her like that, deliberate, steady, with no rush in it. His hand was rough, scarred, but warm. She didn't pull away. That night the air was still again, but the tension no longer felt like it would crush her. She sat by the fire while he sat near her, not speaking much, but their silence had changed. It was no longer a wall between them, but a bridge. She realized then that whatever lay ahead, whether the riders returned, whether the village turned its back on her completely, she would not face it with the same loneliness she had known before. The riders never came back, not right away. Perhaps they had decided to wait. Perhaps they thought fear would do their work for them. But as the days turned into weeks, the widow found herself less afraid. She watched the cowboy repair the last of her fences, chop wood for the long winter, and feed the chickens with a quiet care that said more about him than any story ever could. Slowly, the fear that had once filled her house began to give way to something steadier. The villagers kept whispering. Of course, they always would. But the widow stopped listening. She realized that their voices could not touch the truth she had found, that in opening her door to a stranger, she had found not just danger, but a reminder of her own strength, and of the human need for connection even when it comes at a cost. One evening, as the first snow began to fall across the hills, she stood beside him on the porch, watching the flakes drift down into the quiet fields. He glanced at her, the faintest of smiles tugging at his lips, and said in that calm, steady way, "I told you before, you'd share my heart." Her chest tightened, but this time it wasn't with fear. She nodded, her own smile breaking through the weight of the past months. "And maybe that's enough," she whispered. The snow kept falling, soft and endless, covering the road, the fences, the fields. The world outside was still uncertain, the past not fully gone, the future not fully safe. But in that moment, standing beside him as the quiet night wrapped around them, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The story of the cowboy and the widow did not end with every danger resolved, nor with every question answered. It ended with two people who had carried heavy burdens finding, at last, a place to rest them. And though the road ahead would not be easy, they faced it together, no longer strangers but something more. For in the old American village, where whispers filled the air and nights carried the sound of wind through the hills, a woman who had once lived only in the shadow of her grief had found the courage to open her door, and in doing so, she discovered that even in the harshest places, the heart could still be shared.